Hey everybody, Dr. Brad Dieter from Science Driven Nutrition and Eat to Perform here. Welcome to another lecture at the whiteboard. So today we're obviously going to be talking about the ketogenic diet. Now the reason we're talking about this today is over the last several months there's been two kind of big papers released by Dr. Kevin Hall. The first one, which was published in Cell Metabolism, which basically was a calorie dietary fat restriction results in more weight loss than dietary carbohydrate restriction. Title was something like that. And then most recently they did another metabolic ward study looking at the efficacy of ketogenic diets versus basically a traditional weight loss diet, right? So this kind of prompted a lot of discussion on the internet and in a lot of other contexts of the ketogenic diet. So I really want to break down the ketogenic diet. We're going to talk about it in a few contexts. We're going to talk about it in the context of calories in versus calories out versus hormones in body fat regulation. We're going to kind of dispel some of the ideas and concepts and really tell you that it's not really a battle of the theory of calories in versus calories out or the carbohydrate-insulin obesity. That's not how we should actually look at it. We're going to talk about the actual data from those studies. We're going to talk about them in practical terms. We're going to talk about the context of the ketogenic diet, what it actually means, and what it can actually be used in, and we're going to talk about the practical applications. So you got to stick around for the really juicy stuff, but we're going to focus a lot on the practical applications. So let's just dive in right into the calories in, calories out versus hormones in terms of the arguments for what really regulates body fat mass. So basically we have, the first argument, calories in, calories out, essentially treats the body like a bomb calorimeter, right? Where you've got calories in versus calories out. If it's even, no weight change, no change in body weight, delta is a change sign. If you have more coming in than going out, right, you're obviously going to have an increase in your change, right? You're going to have an increase in delta or your body weight. And if you have more going out than going in, you are going to have a lower change and your body's going to be losing weight, right? So this is calories in, calories out broken down super simple. Now the underlying premise of this idea is that a calorie is a calorie. It doesn't matter whether your calories come from carbohydrates, fats, or protein. That's kind of the way this model treats the idea of diet and obesity. Now, the second one is, I'm calling it the hormone hypothesis here, but really, in the real world, it's carbohydrates cause an increase in insulin, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. It stores fat, reduces fatty acid oxidation, and then that results in an increase in body weight and specifically body fat percentage. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the nuances of insulin and things like that, but there's a couple things to note, right? Is each of these ideas have very testable scientific predictions, right? The calories in, calories out model essentially would state that if carbs and fat are equal in terms of insulin doesn't really make huge differences in body fat. If carbs and fat are equal, it doesn't matter how they go up and down. The body fat level or the body weight is going to stay the same. So essentially, calories in, calories out says carbs, fat, doesn't matter, what happens. However you decide to, we'll keep this simple, however you decide to modulate your calories, as long as the calories are the same, there's going to be no change in body weight. So under the calories in, calories out model, and this is, let's just say this is all isocaloric, that there would be no change, and no change, right? That's essentially what the calories in, calories out model states. I'm going to redraw this. It got a little squished. Now the hormone insulin hypothesis, we'll just put insulin. This would essentially say, we'll just say this is baseline or reference category. This hypothesis essentially assumes that this would increase body weight and this should decrease body weight. All right? That's really as simple as you can break it down and make it be. So these are the testable predictions of calories in versus calories out and the insulin model of obesity, the carbohydrate-insulin hypothesis. So we do have the two studies by Dr. Hall that we mentioned. That have been very well controlled, tightly regulated studies, short-term over a span of 7 days, and longer-term over a span of 28 days. So I'll kind of break these studies down super simple. So we have study 1, and we have study 2. Now I'm not going to get into all of the real nuances because I think that's not super helpful for the discussion that we need to have here. But basically study 1 was 7 days where you take people and you feed them, you try to keep the calories the same, and you decrease carbohydrates in one arm, you decrease fat in the other arm, and you look at which of these groups loses the most weight. Now, the title says that dietary fat results in more weight loss, or restricting dietary fat results in more weight loss than restricting carbohydrates. But when you look at the data and really get into the nuances of it, I think the meaningful interpretation of this study is that regardless of over 7 days, regardless of which macronutrient that you restrict in this situation, you get very, very similar weight loss, right? So these were, in my eyes, almost equivalent, right? Their weight loss was really almost equivalent. And that when you modulate these dietary macronutrients and you keep protein fairly constant, you get changes in substrate oxidation. Either fat oxidation goes up or fat oxidation goes down. Carbohydrate oxidation didn't really change that much between the two groups. A little bit, but nothing substantial. Basically, the weight loss is almost equivalent between the carbohydrate restriction and the fat restriction. Now, we'll leave this up. So this study basically took one group of people. We'll do time 0. They gave them they called it the baseline diet. Okay, standard-ish diet. It ended up being a little bit hypocaloric. We'll talk about that later. This was day 0. This was day 14/15. And then they had them go on the ketogenic diet. Now, this study, the ketogenic diet, it was 5% dietary carbohydrate, 15% dietary protein, and the rest was fat. So this was a highly ketogenic diet. They did all the necessary testing, for urinary ketones. They looked at protein oxidation. Probably one of the best well-controlled metabolism studies you will see in the literature to date. And basically here is the most compelling thing that they found. I'm going to show you essentially what the weight loss looked like. So this would be, we'll just say change in body weight, 0, 15-ish days, 28 days. So they basically saw weight going down. Right after they started the ketogenic diet, they saw a big drop right here. So you can kind of see you've essentially got this drop, and then it actually plateaued. And now this is a result of water loss, right? You get a water loss from glycogen, and after that water loss, you actually didn't see much additional loss of body fat, and that most of the body fat lost in this study and body weight actually occurred in the normal diet isocaloric, or the hypocaloric state, right? They lost about 0.5 kilos of body fat across the whole study, and most of it actually occurred during this phase. So this was 28 days, this is 7 days, so a week and essentially a month. And when you look at all the data from these studies, it really points us to the following conclusion, right? That in tightly regulated studies, where we look at a ketogenic diet or a very low-carb diet, they're very different things. Low carb is not keto. But for the context of this discussion is they had essentially equivalent effects on weight loss. There was no substantial metabolic advantage of a ketogenic diet. So that's really important when we talk about practical applications. We're going to come back to this a little bit more when we get to that piece. So now let's talk about a little bit of the context of the ketogenic diet, what it actually is used for, and what we should really think about it, and then we'll talk about it in the practical applications. Now, as we jump into this, I want to come back to our original point, calories in versus calories out versus hormones. So this is essentially how a lot of people, myself included initially, kind of thought about these two ideas, is we had the calories in, calories out model, and we had the hormone model, right? And there were two very different ideas that had very different predictions on body fat, and they're just two separate pieces. Now, if you ask me, I think the better way to interpret these two theories is to actually nest them within one another, right? Calories is obviously super important. You can't get away from the first law of thermodynamics, right? There's a lot of papers and blog articles that talk about that piece. But when we really think about it, right, I've drawn a figure like this before on the blog, but this is, there's two pieces I want to talk about. Now, that calories in, calories out piece, right, we have one input, right? This is the food that you consume. Now, the out piece, this is a giant cluster, right? What dictates out? Well, age, sex, these are all secondary pieces, not really that important for the discussion and the nuance, but weight, height, NEAT. James Krieger is the big NEAT person. He knows a lot more about this than I do, so I'm not even going to dive into it. If you guys have more, NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so walking around, doing the laundry, whatever movement creates calorie burn from non-exercise physical activity. You can learn a lot more from James. You've got other things, right? Hormones actually do play a role. So this is important, right? Leptin actually plays a giant role in your body's fat metabolism. Insulin does play a role, right? Thyroid plays a role. Cortisol plays a role. This list goes on and on and on and on and on, right? So the thing to remember is all of these pieces, what do these all add up to? These all add up to calories out. So the real picture should not look like those two different Venn diagrams, but it should look like you've got what controls body fat, right? This whole piece is the calories in, calories out model. And what goes into it? Well, hormones are a small piece that falls within it. So this is, I think, probably the best way and the correct way, based on what we know right now in terms of the data, of how to really think about hormones, carbohydrate, insulin, calories in versus calories out. And the data from Kevin's studies, Dr. Hall's studies, excuse me, really highlight this very nicely, because they show that even when you manipulate hormone levels like they did in that study too, they did show large decreases in insulin signaling, or not insulin signaling, but insulin levels, and it didn't really affect body weight over that month long term like they thought it would, or the 2 weeks that each arm was in. So that's really important. Now, let's talk about the practical applications of what this means. So there's a few things I want people to remember, right? The ketogenic diet is a tool. It's one tool in a toolbox of many, of paleo, zone, eat to perform. We have kind of we basically take all the tools and use them as we need to. Atkins, Ornish, Weight Watchers, Mediterranean, ketogenic, low carb, intermittent fasting, carb backloading, da-da-da-da-da. Those are all tools, right? Now, the ketogenic diet is a tool, too. The ketogenic diet can be successful, can equal fat loss, okay? So, it's a tool. There are studies and papers showing it leads to fat loss. Number 3 is it does not convey a metabolic advantage. The data is pretty clear on this. Ketogenic diets do not convey a significant metabolic advantage in terms of fat loss from a fat loss calorie standpoint when you control for dietary protein and you control for overall calories and physical activity. Now, 4, ketogenic diet as a therapy. From my understanding and my knowledge of the ketogenic diet is it was originally used clinically to help combat difficult to control seizures in pediatric patients. So brain metabolism is much different than muscle metabolism, even heart metabolism, liver metabolism, all your other organs. It's much different metabolically. And so they found that in kids who had, difficult to control epilepsy and seizures, that if you give them a ketogenic diet, it reduces a lot of the symptoms and the amount of seizures they have. So the production of ketones and brain utilization of ketones appears to offer some advantage for those things. There are some pilot trials showing that in specific types of cancer that the ketogenic diet has been more beneficial than a Western diet in terms of reducing a lot of the clinical outcomes that they measure for brain tumors. Now, we need to be careful with it because cancer is a multifaceted, multi-phenotype, multi-genotype disease that doesn't lend itself to blanket therapies, right? Just like they all have different metabolomes, they all have different metabolic types. And some cancers thrive. There are papers showing that some tumor types actually use ketone bodies to fuel their metabolism and their growth and metastases in models. So it's important to know that it's a therapy that has currently limited application. It's limited application. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about this piece. I think these two pieces are actually really important. So when in practice would someone like myself or anybody else be recommended a ketogenic diet? Well, there are some benefits to it. And a lot of times people, it can have a better regulation of intake. Some people find that having foods that are higher fat, moderate protein, and very low carbohydrate is easier for them to control the amount of food they consume. So regulation of intake. There's also the adherence piece, right? I think Dr. Andy Galpin was just talking about this yesterday on his Facebook feed about how a lot of times, we all talk about the bad side of restrictive dieting, but sometimes people find very simple black and white rules and less options more beneficial for them. So if a ketogenic diet makes them more adherent to their dietary plan, that's a plus. Some of the other benefits, may be that it's an easier lifestyle, right? There's less choices that they have to make, and it makes it easier for them. So there are some lifestyle benefits. There are some good reasons why some people medically may be on a ketogenic diet. So that's the good thing to know, right? Is first, let's kind of talk a little bit more. We'll kind of wrap this up. It's really not a bad battle anymore of calories in, calories out versus hormones. When you really stop and think about the nuanced pieces of it and what each piece actually means, these theories aren't really in a battle with one another. Is the hormone piece makes up part of the calories in, calories out idea, and it makes up a small piece of it. There's a lot of other moving parts that are probably more important for your basic normal obesity, right? Now, people who have things like leptin, they have inappropriate leptin signaling, they are leptin deficient or things like that. That's where those very, very extreme cases of hormone dysregulation can kind of drive or make up more of the calories in, calories out piece. The data, right? The data suggests that a ketogenic diet can result in fat loss, but doesn't convey a metabolic advantage hormonally or the endocrine milieu, as Dr. Hall likes to talk about. There's no substantial advantage over that. The context, so we talked about the context within which it falls within this argument, and then the practical applications. It's a tool. It can be used successfully. There are cases medically where it's a therapy, and there are normal people who, for fat loss, it can be a tool. But it's got limited application. Some people find it too restrictive. Some people who are athletes find they can't train at a high level on it. So just knowing the nuances of the diet and understanding it is probably the best thing we can do as practitioners, right? Instead of having a straight view of it's so much better, it conveys all this advantage, view it as a tool that can be used successfully in some cases and not successfully in others. So know which scenarios it's appropriate in and use it appropriately. So thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this, and we're going to be breaking this down in a little bit more depth in an article. But thanks so much for tuning in.